My name is Brandan Goodwin. I'm president of the Federalist Society here at Regent. So put together this panel today, kind of discussion on free speech, academic freedom, those kind of things in line with Nadine's new book. So I'm going to introduce kind of our two speakers for today. First, of course, we have the famous Brad Jacob, professor of constitutional law here at Regent. Professor Jacob is a graduate of University of Chicago Law School, and he's been a professor here since 2001. Of course, he is the expert in constitutional law, Concrim Pro, and teaches non-profit tax exempt organizations too, and foundations of law, the best class. And he previously served as the CEO and executive director of Christian Legal Society from 91 to 93. And so thank you, Professor Jacob, for speaking with us today. And then second, today we have Professor Nadine Strossen from New York Law School. Nadine specializes, written and lectured extensively in constitutional law, civil liberties, and international human rights. From 1991 through 2008, she served as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She went to Harvard undergrad and Harvard Law School, graduating magna cum laude from Harvard. She stepped down in 2008 from ACLU president. 3 Supreme Court justices actually attended in her farewell tribute and luncheon. That was Scalia, Ginsburg, and David Souter. So, and she has many, many accolades, go far and few between. So thank you, Nadine, for speaking today. I'm going to start with Professor Jacob.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let me start by saying welcome, Professor Strossen. We're glad to have you back on our campus again. I think we met face-to-face the last time you spoke here. I have to tell the story, though. We actually were co-belligerents back in the early 1990s. I was the CEO of the Christian Legal Society. At the same time, Professor Strossen was the new CEO of the National American Civil Liberties Union. We were both very young, and of course the two organizations are very similar in power and influence, just as a mosquito is similar to a water buffalo. But nevertheless, we are two organizations.
Water buffalo was attacked as a. Is this on? It feels like it's not. Now it is. Maybe we could just. Yeah, we'll just do that.
Easier. Thank you so much. I have to remind you, Brett, we're on a first-name basis, right? That water buffalo was attacked as a racist slur. A student was actually expelled from the University of Pennsylvania. I see some contemporaries of mine remember this very well. It was the beginning of what was called the political correctness movement. And it led, the ACLU defended the free speech right of this student to use that word. We would have defended it even if it were a racial slur, but it was not. And that was one of the incidents that gave rise to the founding of a wonderful, yet another wonderful organization, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. So watch your language.
All right. I must admit I would not have thought water buffalo had racial connotations. The ACLU is a striking Bengal tiger. Is that okay?
As a cat person, I like it.
All right, I'm a cat person too. So we're doing well here. So during the early 90s, the ACLU and the Christian Legal Society were two of the lead organizations in the fight to enact the Religious Freedom Restoration Act after the Supreme Court decimated the free exercise of religion in 1990. So we were actually working together, although I think through surrogates for the most part. Steve McFarland was the guy for me who was handling that battle. So we've been on the same side of battles, and one of the reasons I'm so happy to have you here, Nadine, is that you are a person who is delightfully capable of engaging in friendly, collegial discourse, whether one agrees or disagrees, and that is so lacking in our world today. One of the things that scares me most about our country is the inability of people to disagree agreeably, and so you live that out, the ability to dialogue and share, and I think that's kind of what the heart of what your book is about as well. So can you tell us just a little bit about the book and what led you to write it?
Absolutely.
And right back at you, Brad, and at Regent University, which Rosie was nice enough to welcome me with all kinds of little goodies. And not only welcome, but I had a lot of Hershey's Kisses that said, "Welcome back." I took all of them, by the way. My souvenirs. So I am delighted to be back here, and most of the time that I've been here quite a few times, and most of the times that I've been invited here have been to engage in mutually respectful but very vigorous debates, including with somebody that I have shared the podium with many times, Jay Sekulow, who I know is very busy doing other things, but is also still on your faculty, right? And I, too, really leapt at the opportunity to come back here so soon because I also share, I think everybody agrees that we're somewhat in a state of crisis in this country, and too many people demonizing anybody with whom they disagree even one iota. So you get liberals attacking each other if they're, make one misstep according to somebody's litmus test. And if I can just say for the students here, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir on this, but I have found that it has been so enriching to me as an individual. My life has been so much more enjoyable and interesting to be hanging out with, spending time with, becoming friendly with people with whom I have strong disagreements. That's how Antonin Scalia and I became good enough friends that he was kind enough to join my other friends, more to the liberal end of the court, Ginsburg and Souter, in paying this wonderful honor to me when I stepped down from the ACLU presidency. I like to say we became friends not despite our disagreements, but because of them. We were often invited to debate and discuss with each other in various forums all over the world, and that became an opportunity for not only mutual respect but mutual liking. So it definitely enhances your life just the way diversity of every sort does, to have ideological and religious diversity among those with whom you associate in a social way. But in terms of organizational effectiveness, obviously Christian Legal Society followed this as well. ACLU, I know, has been a more effective advocate because we will collaborate with any individual, official, organization, or group on a particular issue where we agree and where we make a strategic judgment that the collaboration would advance our common agenda, even if we strongly disagree and are fighting against each other on 99% of issues. And that clearly is something that has opened doors for the ACLU to members of Congress, for example, and to the kind of respect that we got from justices who would ordinarily disagree with our positions. And so you become more effective in advancing your agenda if you're open to that kind of collaboration. The reason I wrote the book, whose main title is Hate, is all too obvious from today's news, yesterday's news, last week's news. I felt motivated to write the book starting the process started several years ago, and I know it was specifically in response to the well-publicized unjustified police killings of unarmed African-American men, including Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, that started a wave of student protests around the country, starting at the University of Missouri, where I was very happy to speak recently at the joint invitation of the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society. And a little plug, somebody please found an American Constitution Society here. Anyway, I'm allowed to have advertising, right? And there's the ACLU chapter here, too, now that I mentioned it. But commercial advertising break over. So I was thrilled that there was this rise of student activism in support of causes that have always been dear to my heart. Racial justice, crusade against violence against women, rights of immigrants and refugees, rights of LGBT people. But it became clear, and let me put a parenthesis that I always feel necessary, again because of the polarization that we have in our society. This should go without saying, but I don't think it does. The vast, vast, vast majority of law enforcement officers are brave and dedicated, courageous men and women who are putting their lives on the line to defend our lives and liberty. And liberty, which I prize so much, I know would not exist without law and order. So we cannot demonize whole groups of people because of the unjust and illegal actions of a few of them. And that shouldn't have to go without saying. And I know that it's the vast majority of law enforcement officers who are probably have the most at stake when there is a bad apple among them. We know that no profession is immune from abuse. Dare I say, the legal profession and the judicial profession are also not immune. So that's my parenthetical. But the downside of the activism was we started to see too many incidents where students and faculty members made clear that they saw free speech, including speech that is robust enough to extend to hateful and hated ideas. They saw that as the enemy. And we started seeing disinvitations of controversial speakers and requests for trigger warnings and safe spaces and calls to punish so-called hate speech. I had been convinced, based on long-standing experience studying what went on in this country as well as other countries, that censorship is not only on principle inconsistent with individual liberty and democracy, but actually does more harm than good for all of those wonderful causes that the students were agitating for and that I support, equality and dignity and diversity and societal harmony, inclusivity and individual mental well-being. Well-intended as censorship is, it actually does more harm than good. So I wrote the book. Basically, the main target for the book is social justice warriors on the left, quite frankly, because there has been much more consistent support for this kind of free speech on the part of conservatives and libertarians. So everybody should find some arguments in here that are persuasive, but the review I got in the Federalist really hit the nail on the head. He said it's a good book for lawyers and for everybody, but it's clear that Strossen's main audience were non-lawyers, so I hope it will be comprehensible to non-lawyers and liberals.
It seems to me that part of the issue we struggle with, when we talk about hate and we talk about allowing people to speak when we find them offensive, is that our culture in so many ways has reduced issues to sound bites, and we so oversimplify things. I'm reminded a few years ago, my friend Rick Duncan, you may know Rick, teaches at the University of Nebraska, who was a Christian and pretty conservative on most things, but they were going around campus asking faculty members if they wanted some kind of a rainbow symbol on their office door to declare their office a safe place for gay people. This is when, a few years back, when being gay was more controversial, more looked down upon than it is today. And Professor Duncan said, absolutely, I'll put that on my door. My office is a safe place. And taking the position, which is pretty similar to my own, to say, well, as a Christian, I believe homosexual conduct is wrong because I believe the Bible teaches that God made sex to be between a husband and a wife married to one another. But I'm not going to hurt someone or demean someone because they are not living by that standard. I don't expect non-Christians to live by the same standards I do. Even Christians, we're still all sinners, and we do lots, and to be able to say, well, I may think the conduct is morally wrong, but that doesn't dictate what I think about, certain laws, and certainly doesn't mean that I want to have, criminal sodomy statutes and some of these kinds of things. but I think our culture really wants to make everything this bipolar. If you're the good guy, you must believe all of these things. If you're the bad guy, you must believe all of those things. And does that tie in with this idea that if we can get more speech on issues, maybe people will start going a little deeper, understanding a little better instead of being so superficial?
There's a lot to respond to in there. That's very, very important. First of all, there is a lot of good news. So despite the fact that people who are very active in politics, including university politics, do tend to be extremist at either end of the political spectrum and do tend to demonize anybody who disagrees with them, even in dotting one I or crossing one T. There is a lot of evidence that they are overly influential but still small minority. There, again, those of us of a certain age will remember a phrase from the 80s that was the silent majority, and I will claim that phrase and use it in a different way, and unfortunately now it literally means silent, although that's changing. That
I think Nixon coined that. In
oh,
the
was
60s.
it? Was really? Okay. You know what? You're
Originally,
absolutely
Nixon.
right. I'm getting. You know what? I'm getting it mixed up with the moral majority,
Yeah,
which
well,
came in the 80s. So to recycle the term, there was a study that came out just about a week or two ago called More in Common. That's actually an organization that had the hypothesis that that is true for so many societies that seem to be politically divided. And they recently issued a report about the United States, which did indicate that the vast majority of us have so much more in common on even the most fraught issues: immigration, affirmative action, racial issues, criminal justice, you name it. But we are disproportionately silent, especially in the political process. And the people who are most active and who vote more and who run for office more are much more on the edges of the spectrum. And so I thought one of the good things about that study, and I'm sure the reason why the organization is doing it, is to embolden people to raise your voices, because it can have a chilling effect. None of us, it's not, having a lot of experience of being attacked for my ideas and seeing my loved ones attacked, that's hard to put up with. And I can understand even tenured faculty members who are at no risk of losing their jobs are saying they don't want to speak up because it's not pleasant to be ostracized or shamed or humiliated by the Twitter mob, and it's those who are on the extreme who are disproportionately exercising that power. Let me tell you an example that I just found out about from a friend and colleague of mine. I was having an email exchange with him as I landed at the airport. His name is Sam Abrams. He is a professor at Sarah Lawrence College, which is like all liberal arts colleges, I guess, is overwhelmingly liberal. And Sam is one of a number of conservative professors. This is kind of sad commentary on our culture, who have talked about, and they use the language of the gay rights movement, having been closeted in their conservative views until they got tenure, because they were so reasonably afraid that if they revealed their conservative views, that their scholarship would be looked at in a different light, everything would be looked at in a different light, and they wouldn't get tenure. After Sam got tenure with outstanding scholarship, and I should say, by the way, I should say this expressly, I am a proud, bleeding heart liberal. And I'm not going to say but, I'm going to say and, therefore, I absolutely defend freedom of thought for people whose views I disagree with. That, to me, is the essence of the traditional concept of liberalism. Okay, so those cards on the table. Sam has been doing a lot of studies about documenting the disproportion of, the huge disproportion of faculty members and others on campuses of the liberal persuasion. And he and I are both active in an organization called Heterodox Academy, which based on actual social science, you can show that the pursuit of truth in every field is going to be advanced by having people with different viewpoints, because they more robustly critique and analyze and force each other to plumb new depths of analysis. That doesn't happen if everybody is just mouthing the same accepted orthodoxy. Anyway, to make a long story short, last week Sam published an excellent op-ed in the New York Times based on his most recent research, which shows that there's the skewing of administrators is even worse than it is of faculty members, including in particular the administrators who enforce rules of conduct, which means that students who dare to voice opinions that are controversial are really being railroaded. And his office this is what I did not know and has not gotten publicity, but he gave me permission to talk about it. His office was completely trashed, and the administration at his school is not saying anything. They're not speaking up for his academic freedom. They're not doing anything to investigate who committed these actual acts of violence.
Let's go back to this idea with hate. The way to respond is to have more speech, kind of an old cliche of free speech, right? The remedy for bad speech is more speech, not censorship. And I want to explore with you are there limits on that principle? And if so, how do we draw those lines? The Supreme Court historically has had some kind of funny ways of addressing these issues through most of the history of free speech law. You saw these attempts to create categorical exclusions, that certain things aren't free speech, whether it's obscenity, which is very narrowly defined, whether it's fighting words, language that would cause the reasonable person to respond violently. By the way, the actual fighting words in the case that created that doctrine were damned fascist. That was considered sufficient to make any reasonable person erupt in violence. Anybody want to call me a fascist? It's okay. I won't hit you. I don't think I am one. But so they would create these categories of speech. Incitement, they played with things like clear and present danger. That it's one thing to say, well, wouldn't it be great if someone assassinated somebody someday, and it's another thing to say, let's all grab our pitchforks and torches, we're going to go over there. Now, today, the court is more likely, in most areas of law, to do some sort of balancing test and start talking about strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny, but we haven't seen a lot of that in free speech. But the question of is there any speech that is just so reprehensible? We all have our favorite hypotheticals, right? And even before the Phelps decision, Phelps v. Snyder in the Supreme Court, I've always liked to use Westboro Baptist Church. The very name of it offends me because I'm a Baptist, and these folks need to understand God's grace, and they clearly don't. But this is a group that basically nobody likes, nobody agrees with. The folks who, they show up with signs saying things like God hates fags and, soldiers rot in hell and all this, and offend people at funerals. And they're kind of the classic example that the tiny group saying stuff that conservatives don't like, liberals don't like, Republicans, Democrats, Christians, secularists, Jews, nobody likes what these people say. And yet the Supreme Court case that upheld the way they were allowed to speak, I think, was correctly decided. If not them, who? Is there any line to be drawn, and if so, what would it look like?
I think the Supreme Court, by and large, in the recent past, has come up with the correct dividing line between punishable speech and protected speech. You know, there are a few particular cases that I disagree with. I think the obscenity exception is long overdue to be overturned. I think it's an outlier, inconsistent with most current jurisprudence. But with asking for forgiveness in advance for my fellow constitutional law experts, including those in the audience, because the law is there's got a lot of inconsistency and caveats, but on the whole, you can summarize the vast majority of the Supreme Court's free speech jurisprudence by two basic rules, which I summarize in my book, and I think they make so much common sense that merely for people to understand what speech is protected and what is not protected, I think the vast majority of people would say, oh, that makes sense. We really do support the law. I certainly became even more respectful than I had been before I, forced myself to try to distill the law into these two fundamental principles. And one is the reason why I was shaking my head when Brad asked, is there any speech that is so reprehensible that it should not be protected? And the answer to that from the Supreme Court, and I agree, is no, because of the viewpoint neutrality, or sometimes it's called content neutrality principle. We may never punish speech solely because its viewpoint, its message, its content, its ideas are so loathsome or vile. We disagree with it, we repudiate it, we vaguely fear it. That is never a justification for censorship. If we hate the message, then we have to take non-censorial steps to deal with it, including counter speech, which has been very effective with respect to the Westboro maybe I'll censor the word Westboro so-called Baptist Church.
I call them the Phelps folks, that crowd.
However, there's, of course, a complementary principle, which I call the emergency principle, and it grew out of the old concept of clear and present danger, but because that was misused and in so many ways, I prefer the Supreme Court has pretty much dropped that terminology, and instead there's this functional concept of an emergency. Speech based on its content alone can never be punished, but if you get beyond content and look at context, if speech in all the facts and circumstances directly causes certain specific, imminent, serious harm, then it can and should be punished. And much so-called hate speech, speech with a hateful or discriminatory message, does occur in that kind of context. It can pose a true threat where it means to and does instill a reasonable fear in the people who are targeted by the speech that they are going to be subject to violence. If it constitutes an intentional incitement of imminent violence, and the violence is likely to happen imminently, the speech can and should be punished. If it is a targeted harassment or bullying that is sufficiently severe and pervasive that it interferes with somebody's equal educational or employment opportunity. And when you look at, and I quote some examples in my book of people who say, oh, the United States ought to move more in the direction of Europe and all these other countries that punish hate speech, and then they give examples of speech that they should be subject to punishment. 99% of the time, the examples they cite are already punishable in our country under these very common sense rules. But I do part company with them over saying the mere fact that the idea is hated is enough of a justification to censor it. And let me give you an example that just came down from the European Court of Human Rights last week, where I know our allies included a lot of religious conservative organizations, including the European Center for Law and Justice, which is the counterpart for the American Center for Law and Justice, where Jay Sekulow was the founding guru and still a leading light. And Europe basically, the European Court of Human Rights basically upheld a blasphemy law in order to protect Muslims from speech that was critical in any way of certain Muslim, well, in this case it was such a bizarre opinion. It was almost incomprehensible. The court was tying itself in knots. But basically, the leader of a right-wing political party in Austria, who definitely was against Muslim immigration, I completely reject that viewpoint, but I certainly defend her right to hold seminars about the teachings of Islam, which is what she was doing. And she quoted, apparently this is widely accepted among Muslim scholars, that one of Muhammad's wives was Aisha, was 6 years old when he married her and 9 years old when they consummated the marriage. To the best of my knowledge, that's not factually disputed, but there's a lot of debate about, was that right and proper, especially at the time, and the mores of the time, and so forth. And she said, today we would consider that to be pedophilia. And she was criminally convicted for teaching that information and that characterization of it. She had an option to buy her way out of prison, but basically the prison term was, I think it was half a year. I mean, it was not trivial by any stretch of the imagination. To add insult to injury, and one of the reasons why these laws are so dangerous, they're so subjective, right? And the court certainly added to the subjectivity by saying, well, it's fine to criticize a religion and a religious beliefs because we no longer accept the concept of blasphemy in Europe. But if you do it in an unnecessary way that unnecessarily or unduly defames somebody who is important to the religion, then it's not protected. And given the subjectivity, you won't be surprised that this so-called standard is applied extremely unevenly. And there have been recent cases where that very same court, correctly in my view, but inconsistently, has upheld extremely defamatory and insulting speech against Christianity. And I haven't done this, but I know my friends at the Alliance Defense Fund are probably doing it. I have a hypothesis that if you compare Islamic speech versus Christian, insulting the two different religions, that there would very much be a double standard. And sadly, one of the concerns is the belief that too many Muslims, not only in Europe but all over the world, will erupt into violence, as we saw with respect to the Muhammad cartoons. So in an interest of protecting against violence, supposedly that's a rationale for, in effect, imposing religious orthodoxy. If I can say one other thing about the Fred Phelps crowd, they are a perfect example of the efficacy of counter speech. Not only are their messages just drowned out by counter demonstrators who have come up with wonderful techniques, including spreading your arms like angels to block their view from people who are going to funerals where they're demonstrating. But there's another really interesting example because, and I love to talk to my Christian friends about this because they always talk about hate the sin, love the sinner. So people in that spirit have been doing something that I don't have the time or patience to do, and I'm so grateful to them, engaging in a one-on-one basis with people who have hateful ideas and trying to wean them away from those ideas. And it turns out you don't do that. You don't start through rational debate. You start by building up relationships of trust. And then from that becomes a base to get the other person to rethink her or his ideas on his or her own. And there have been many, many, many moving accounts of how this has worked. There are TED Talks about it. There are books about it. The one example I'm thinking of is Megan Phelps Roper, who, along with that whole family, was born into this so-called church, completely indoctrinated in it, completely believed it, was a leader of the church, went online to recruit people to join the church, and two wonderful, loving people who had hope that they could convert her and redeem her, interacted with her in very protracted, patient, loving way, and ultimately redeemed her. And she's written, and she married one of them. She's completely like excommunicated from her family, but she's got a new family now. And she wrote a very, very moving and persuasive account of this in the New Yorker.
Yeah, it is interesting, your references to Europe and the issue with Islam. Here in the United States, there have been a number of examples of things that are very offensive to Christians. The Last Temptation of Christ was a movie that got lots of publicity. At one point there was controversy about the National Endowment for the Arts. There was a Hiss Christ, the guy had his artwork was a glass jar full of urine with a crucifix dropped in it, and these kind of things happen, and we see a debate here in the United States: should Christians go to see the movie? Should the government fund the art? We don't see violence. We don't see the kinds of responses, and I wonder how much of that is unique to Islam. Is it some of that just the culture's different? I don't know that there's an answer, but they're clearly, the battle lines are different than they are for the most part here in the States. I'm thinking in these lines about university campuses. And you and I both teach at private university campuses, so they are not subject to the First Amendment and can engage in significant levels of speech control without violating any law, and that's just because they're private institutions. But there's a huge phenomenon at public universities of speech controls, telling people what they can and cannot say, which just seems so totally in opposition to the whole idea of higher education, which is to be exposed to different ideas, different viewpoints. Maybe you change your views, maybe you strengthen your views, but you hear other people, you deal with that. How did this approach become so widespread on university campuses?
Before I answer your question, Brad, I'm going to take the liberty of commenting on the first part of what you just said, because I think it's very important to point out that for all of the suppression of speech in Europe, and it is pervasive. I gave examples of where some anti-Christian, because it's so unpredictable and capricious, I gave examples of where some anti-Christian speech has been held to be protected, but I give examples in my book from all the other countries that enforce hate speech laws that are otherwise comparable to the United States, not only Western Europe, but Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And here I deliberately give examples from across the ideological and religious perspective, including everything from atheists to every other devout person. And no matter who you are, you should find examples that would just make you cringe. How can the government possibly be punishing that speech that is so important, and not only to me as an individual, but also to a society and to our political system where we are debating these issues? So there's extremely strict censorship, much worse than I had thought before I did the research for the book. And it has been incredibly ineffective in countering actual discrimination and violence. So I can't go further without saying something about the massacre of my fellow Jews in Pittsburgh over the weekend. And yet, horrific as that was, if you've been following the commentary, it pales in comparison to the anti-Semitic violence that has been rampant throughout Europe in the recent past, including in Germany and France, which are the countries that, for historic reasons, have the strictest anti-hate speech laws that are so strict that they punish as anti-Semitic hate speech something that I would, would protect all hate speech, but in particular, a major newspaper, the major newspaper in France, Le Monde, was criminally convicted for criticizing a particular policy of the Israeli government. People who are lobbying for Palestinian rights have been prosecuted for hate speech in Europe. So they have an extremely strict concept of anti-Semitism that is extremely strictly enforced, and yet Jews are fleeing Europe in fear in response to incredibly violent attacks. Some of them have been well publicized in this country. Recently, Angela Merkel, the head of the German government, felt compelled for the very first time to appoint a new cabinet-level commissioner against anti-Semitism. That's how serious the problem is there. So, and a number of European human rights activists, a growing number of them, I quote them in my book, have said we ought to move more in the American direction, away from censorship and more toward civil society enforcing anti-discrimination laws, anti-violence laws, using counter-speech, not because of the First Amendment. They don't have the First Amendment, but strictly from the perspective of what is actually effective. And, add all of those concerns, the principled First Amendment concern, the essential importance for democracy, and the Supreme Court in its cases upholding freedom of speech for hate speech, which has occurred, by the way, unanimously, not a single justice for all of their disagreements on so many other issues, including First Amendment issues, from left to right. This is a bedrock principle, and one of the reasons is they say that this kind of speech is critical to democracy. How can we, the people who hold the sovereignty, possibly responsibly exercise that power if we're not free to engage in very robust debate on these sensitive and therefore important issues? So take all of those concerns, and then on campus you add the additional concern of academic freedom, the search for the truth. Again, on the subject of blasphemy, somebody said, I don't know who, maybe somebody else will remember, every great truth began as a blasphemy. So if we're going to we should have more freedom of speech on campus than we should have in the rest of society. And most private educational institutions voluntarily choose to protect all of the values that they would be required to protect under the First Amendment if you were a public campus. Those who have religious orientations might make certain exceptions consistent with their religious beliefs, but on the whole, saying for educational reasons, for reasons of advancing research, we choose to protect our students and our faculty members' First Amendment rights. Free speech rights.
I want to take a few minutes for questions from the audience before we finish. Brandan, are you going to carry the mic around? So as you're thinking about a question, let me quickly make a comment and ask one brief question of Nadine. My comment is, if there are students here at Regent Law School who would like to start a chapter of either the American Constitution Society or the ACLU, I will happily serve as their faculty sponsor, even though I may not agree with everything the chapter stands for, but I would facilitate the ability to have that kind of dialogue.
And I've been the faculty advisor for the FedSoc at New York Law School. So, and I have to thank Brandan, who's done such a phenomenal job in organizing this and executing it. Thank you so much.
And secondly, let me ask if folks would like to get a hold of the book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, where can they get it?
Right outside. Yeah, we're selling it out here? Wow, that's an excellent response.
Can people get a signature in the book? Okay, so this is a great opportunity today. Why don't we see if there's some questions for Nadine from the audience?
Maybe we have a question.
Thanks for coming. What's your opinion of Colorado versus Hill? You know the case?
Yeah, very well.
I'm even putting aside the fact that I'm so pro-life.
Yeah.
I'm an absolutist on free speech like you, and In doing my best to try to put aside my own pro-life views, I think Scalia had the better part of the argument in that case.
Yeah.
In dissent. I wonder what you
Oh,
think.
we lost our microphone.
That's okay, so I don't like to stand behind the podium, but
Did we lose it?
Brandon's getting more exercise. Oh. This
There
one's not
you go,
live.
let's hand that.
The ACLU,
ACLU filed a brief in that case together with the AFL-CIO, and of course we are on the side of free speech. Scalia's dissent, it was a 5-4 decision, was absolutely correct. I don't want to bore other people with the argument, but it's a good. I mean, it was a Colorado law that clearly was designed only to suppress anti-abortion, pro-life demonstrators. That was completely clear, not only from the language of the statute, but from the legislative history. And rather than, it would have been less damaging to the First Amendment if the Supreme Court had said, we're just going to make an abortion exception, right? That would have been less damaging. Instead, they went into contortions to say, this is a content-neutral law, right? Not one. So it was violating that cardinal content neutrality principle that I told you about. But the good news is I think Colorado versus Hill has been essentially overturned by the Supreme Court's more recent decision, whose name I'm blanking out on. And it was so interesting. They didn't in so many words say we are overturning it, but it was very clear that, I mean, the rationale and the holding were completely inconsistent with it. And it was not cited once, and commentators are recognizing that, in effect, it's a dead letter. And now you have liberal justices, interestingly enough, who are balking at, they're saying the court has too broad a concept of content discrimination. And I think it's kind of result-oriented on the part of the liberal justices, but on the whole, I think that departure from Colorado versus Hill is very welcome.
Of course, that law applied to any protest outside of medical facilities, so all those appendectomy protesters were subject to the same law.
Thanks again for visiting us, Professor Strossen. Appreciate it very much. How much do you think the suppression of speech comes from maybe a materialistic worldview that says that speech doesn't really communicate a rational idea, but instead is an instrument of power? And since it's simply an instrument of power or force, it should be susceptible to regulation and regulate other power and force.
How much of that is sincerely held?
It's a very good question, and I think that's one rationale, and there are other rationales for equating speech, which the Supreme Court often calls verbal conduct or expressive conduct, with other kinds of conduct. And I think it raises a very serious question. And in writing my book, I actually lived through the John Stuart Mill argument that even for an idea that you have cherished and deeply believed, there's something positive about being forced to confront an argument against it. So it really, because of these fundamental questions about why should we treat speech any differently? Why should it be treated? It's just a matter of power. It's just like another kind of assault. It's a verbal assault. And I came to two conclusions, which may well seem very obvious, but I had never articulated it to myself before, which is, of course, speech is incredibly powerful, and an exercise of it can empower. And I came to the conclusion, therefore, it's especially important for those who have traditionally lacked other kinds of power. Free speech has been the only way for them to advance their causes, the only effective way. But basically, the other major rationale for speech, So on your question, which I think has been grabbed by the liberals on the Supreme Court, Elena Kagan famously charged that free speech has been weaponized to advance certain conservative causes. There, I think the best answer was in the New York Review of Books by my ACLU colleague, David Cole, who's now the legal director of the ACLU. Interestingly enough, David is very much of a left person. He worked for the Center for Constitutional Rights, and David is taking such a strong classic defense of free speech against a lot of opposition, even within the ACLU itself. And he wrote a wonderful response to that charge of power politics. And it was partly based on principle, but partly based on, well, if we're going to get into analyzing it from that perspective, it's those who have been traditionally excluded and marginalized that have the biggest stake here. So that's, I'll just refer you to David rather than taking away time from another audience question.
We're almost out of time. I saw one in the back, Brandan. Yeah.
Reiterate, thank you for coming. Can you comment on the recent NIFLA decision? I hope that this would be a more bipartisan decision rather than a 5-4 case. NIFLA versus Becerra, the California Reproductive Freedom Act.
Yeah, I know. I'm not that
5-4 decision.
Yeah, we know the decision, but I read it so long ago.
No problem. Yeah, just, you know, discussion of professional speech, and I was hoping at least to grab Justice Kagan to a classic free, you know, that didn't happen. Any commentary? I was also surprised and disappointed that the case was so narrowly decided. You know, I can only conclude that for four justices on the court, they saw it more as an abortion case than a free speech case. I mean, there are certainly, just as there are folks in this country whose pro-life views lead them to basically discard any other legal principle to protect life, there are those on the other side who believe that the right to choose is so fundamental that they will discard any other legal principle to advance that position. And if that's not the answer, why four justices couldn't stand against governmentally coerced speech, then I don't know what it is.
Because it really seemed like another Colorado v. Hill, right? And I'm hoping that was a relic of the past, gone, and some of the liberals had moved to the classic free speech position. But it seems as if, at least now, just because there's a conservative majority, is the really only reason it was up there.
And as I recall, there were two provisions that were at issue, and there was one that I was particularly surprised about. But quite frankly, the reason why I can't give you a detailed answer is when I look at that and some of the other recent decisions that have involved both free speech and religious freedom, they're so contorted that I mean, the votes are contorted, and, you know, partial concurrences and partial dissents. But I just, you know, I've got it on my to-do list if I want to try to work this through and see if I can come up with some rationale for harmonizing what is their doctrine in these areas, because I really don't even know what the doctrine is at this point.
It's almost as much of a mess as the Establishment Clause. I think it's very hard to find rules. Yeah.
Is there time for one more? Yeah, that's ridiculous.
All the deans hiding in the back row.
Let me echo, thank you, Professor Strossen, for being here. Maybe to end on maybe a more positive note in some ways, as you've spoken so eloquently on free speech in so many ways is under attack. But at the same time, we look at our society, and there's such negative, hurtful, just insightful speech that we see all the time. Seems now more than ever, even though I'm sure history, you know, repeats itself. You talk about the way to combat problematic speech is with more speech. How can we take that, and what counsel would you give us in your expertise about how to counsel negative speech with good speech?
Thank you so much for that hanging curveball right over the plate. But seriously, that is the overriding message of my book. And just as I became convinced more than ever about how ineffective and potentially counterproductive censorship is, I became so much more encouraged about the efficacy of counter speech. And more people and institutions and foundations and programs are investing money and resources into stimulating it, studying it, encouraging it, including the online companies, to their credit, are putting a lot of money into studying how can we ferret out and respond to hate speech on the internet. And one of the things about the internet is that it allows you to study in a more systematic way what strategies are effective. And I would just have to say this, that, you know, let a zillion flowers bloom, because in every different context, there's a different kind of counter speech that is called for and most effective. So on many college campuses, if some hate monger has been invited, those who specialize in these areas, including the Anti-Defamation League, say the most effective strategy is to say nothing, right? Exercise your free speech rights by remaining silent, because you're trying to silence the hateful message, but in fact you're amplifying it by trying to censor it and disrupt it. You're feeding into the strategy of the hate mongers. I gave you an example of compassionate reaching out. Even, you know, I, as an advocate in public forums, usually think of counter speech in terms of debating about the ideas. Well, but there's this other strategy to try to persuade people who are on the fringes, on the margins, who are considering the ideas. But you can even go after these confirmed hate mongers, and through compassionate outreach, empathetic outreach, win them away. There are so many now that they're using the term formers to describe themselves, and have formed their own organizations, including Life After Hate, where these people are full-time reaching out to other hate mongers, and this has now spread internationally. By all means, leaders of campuses should denounce the message when there's a hate message that's in their communities. Same thing for our larger society. People who have been disparaged by hate speech say that it is incredibly meaningful to have the ideas condemned, and to have affirmations of respect for their humanity. There are many situations where people unwittingly will say something that causes hurt or harm because of insensitive use of language. There, a sincere apology is, again, social science backs up common sense that it is very meaningful. So I think the mere fact that you're asking the question, what can I say, what can I do, all of us should say that every day. In the wake of the massacre in Pittsburgh, I've seen a lot of a commentary, including from leaders of the Jewish community, and none of them has called for censorship, which is wonderful. And a number of them are making a point that I also raise myself, which is those of us, especially those of us who oppose censorship, and in a society that opposes it, we have more of a moral responsibility, never a legal duty, but a moral responsibility to do all we can to oppose the hatred. And I think you just see that evident when you see the spontaneous affirmations of support for those who were killed this weekend in communities all over the country. I'm so proud of Americans and across all denominations and all over the country, big cities, small towns, who I think the chorus of love and anti-hate is drowning out the message. And it's not just an idealistic theory. I truly believe that in practice, love is going to conquer hate.
Thank you to the speakers for coming.